Utopian Alternatives and Abolitionism. Although actually I'm not going to finish all of abolitionism on this video, you'll see it also on the next one as well, so it kind of straddles a few different things. So, utopian alternatives. During this time period in antebellum America, basically you have on one hand reformers who want to improve the existing order, and then you have individuals who feel like the existing order couldn't be fixed. And so you get these utopians who basically wanted a perfect society by withdrawing from society and its confining institutions. They wanted something that was just more personally satisfying and an alternative to a lot of the competitive materialistic market of this time period. Most of these alternatives are going to be, or at least most of the successful ones, were religious sects that reordered sexual and economic relations within their community. So a great example of this would be the Shakers. Their origins go back to the teachings of Anne Lee, who was actually an illiterate factory worker in the mid-18th century in England. She had this revelation in 1770 that the second coming of Christ was going to be fulfilled in her own womanly form. And then in 1774, she had another vision that basically led her and all of her followers to move to America. You can imagine the persecution she might have faced leading up to this. The thing is, after her death, basically her disciples are going to establish this first Shaker community. It was very much organized around communism. Communism is basically a social structure. It's based off of the common ownership of property, that all property is held in common, such as everyone owns it is the idea. It also organized society by having the sexes live and work apart from each other. Instead, they would come together and dance during religious worship. And this was like supposed to give them that emotional release, because the Shaker community also had enforced sexual desire, basically. So there was not allowed any sexual relations, which I'm going to come back to that because that's going to be an issue in a second. Women also enjoyed equality in the Shaker community, and so it's no surprise that there was actually about twice as many women in these communities. The thing is, when you're enforcing sexual denial, your numbers are going to dwindle because of celibacy. So the only way they got new members was basically through recruitment, and so it just slowly dwindles out. Another example of one of these utopian communities was the Oneida community. It was established in 1847, and it put forward ideas like plural marriage, community nurseries, group discipline, once again, common ownership of property. However, then their leader, John Humphrey Noyes, was actually charged with adultery, and he ends up fleeing to Canada in 1879. The community did survive into the 20th century, but it will run into financial difficulties and soon collapse. That's the thing, is nearly all of these utopian alternative plan communities generally have that issue of financial difficulties followed by collapse. A great example of this would be like the New Harmony community. Basically, once again, you see that they're a big proponent of utopian socialism and establishing this new order within society. But within 2 years of being established in 1825, they have inadequate financing, internal bickering, and it will soon collapse. The only secular utopian alternative community to gain any kind of lasting fame is going to be Brook Farm. This is near Boston. It's established in 1841. It basically surrounded itself using the transcendentalist philosophy of Ralph Waldo Emerson. However, even this is going to disband after about 6 years because it was an economic failure. Although it should be said that it did inspire a lot of intellectuals such as like Nathaniel Hawthorne. Which actually brings us to the last bullet point on this slide. I don't have this on a separate slide because it's kind of an awkward point. The thing is, when we're looking at all of these reforms and we're looking at the idea of a utopian alternative, while all this is going on, we're also seeing America have a distinct national literature being born. You get authors writing such as Walt Whitman, Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville. And the thing is, a lot of the themes that show up in their writings, and so these themes of this national American literature, are a lot of the themes we see in the reform efforts and these utopian alternatives. That there's this concern about, the splintering of society and the selfishness of society. And you can see this through books like Moby Dick, the obsession with the whale. So that could be seen as materialism on some level, that material thing that gets so obsessive that you end up dying. The Scarlet Letter, that clearly, if you've ever read the Scarlet Letter, it's, about the amorality of society on some level. And so it's very much having those same critiques that these reformers and utopian alternatives had. And then you have abolitionism. So slavery really was the great national sin according to abolitionists. They are going to, during this time, attack slaveholders as well as those who were apathetic towards slavery, because that ends up helping support slavery. And so you see protests are really going to come together in both the North and the South, though we are going to see a split in the abolitionist movement, and I'll get to that actually on the next slide, on the next video. So when we're looking at early 19th century abolitionism, almost all white Americans who did want emancipation were also concerned that the emancipation of enslaved people would lead to a race war, or if not that, the debasement of Americans' superior status through racial inbreeding. So you can see the racism still there. So we're going to see things like in 1817, reformers from the North and the South are actually going to come together and form the American Colonization Society. This is going to be slaveholders such as Henry Clay, James Madison, James Monroe. And what these people wanted was they wanted a gradual emancipation combined with the removal of all Black people from America to Africa. This is basically how they viewed America becoming all free and avoiding a racial bloodbath in the process. So really they wanted America to be free, but also they wanted America to be all white. This doesn't really have a chance of success. First of all, it didn't appeal to slave owners due to all the profits that they had. And it just wasn't feasible to afford to buy or purchase every enslaved person to return them to Africa, or not even return them to Africa, because that's the other issue. Most free Africans, by this point in time, we're looking at 1817, and so then we're getting into the 1830s and stuff. Most free Africans were native born, so they saw themselves as African Americans and thus should enjoy every right and blessing of, Republican liberty. So the idea of forcing them to move to Africa really would be banishment. And this would be considered, cruel and actually a direct violation of the principles America was founded on. We're also going to see when in the abolitionist movement during this time period, African Americans are going to get involved. Basically, they have their own churches a lot of times in northern cities that would go on to found some 50 abolitionist societies. A lot of times they also were a refuge for fugitive slaves. You also get things like the first African American newspaper in 1827, which was the Freedom's Journal. And then in 1829, David Walker, who was a free Black man, is going to publish the Appeal to Colored Citizens of the World. In this appeal, he's basically going to say, firstly, really, if you look at it, America is more our, being African Americans, country than it is white people's country. Because, after all, the soil of America is really enriched with African Americans' blood and tears. And that's the thing, just stepping out of this for just a second, it is really important to note that a lot of the infrastructure of America during its, initial years and everything really was extremely dependent on enslaved labor. So going back, though, in this appeal to colored citizens, David Walker is going to then go on to say, and wouldn't it be terrible for you if we have to obtain our freedom through fighting? Just a little bit of a veiled threat there. The thing is, that was published in 1829. Nat Turner's rebellion breaks out in 1831. And so these kinds of events are basically going to make the Americans who were in these kinds of societies abandon any kind of illusion of colonization and really take a new approach when it comes to abolitionism. When looking at abolitionism, you have to include William Lloyd Garrison, who you can see here. He was very much a leading figure in early abolitionism. He had actually been a co-editor of a newspaper in Baltimore, but before 1 year had even occurred, he was arrested and convicted of criminal libel for basically editorials against a Massachusetts merchant that was engaged in the domestic slave trade. He is going to emerge from prison with an unquenchable hatred for slavery. He then would return to Boston, launch his own anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator, remember I talked about that a little bit before, in 1831. A year later, he is going to be instrumental in founding the New England Anti-Slavery Society. Now, the New England Anti-Slavery Society had two big goals. The first of which was immediatism, the immediate moral commitment to end slavery. And remember, I've talked about that before a few videos back and everything. And then the other goal was racial equality. And that's a big deal because as we're going to get into more and more of the abolitionist movement, not all abolitionists want racial equality. All abolitionists are wanting to end slavery, but ending slavery is not the same thing as giving African Americans equal rights. And so it's a big deal that the New England Anti-Slavery Society did want racial equality. And they would argue that really with only these things together, could America really end slavery without violence? So they denounce slavery, they're advocating for black rights. This has that moral urgency of like many of the other reforms we've looked at. But this original message rarely is going to go beyond free black communities in the North. However, then British abolitionists in 1833 are going to be successful in emancipating the slaves of the British West Indian colonies through gradual emancipation. This really is going to inspire white and black abolitionists to gather and redouble their efforts. And at this time, in 1833, they are going to form the American Anti-Slavery Society. Now, this society is going to really spread the abolitionist message through rallies, paid lectures, children games and toys, and then the big one was through the printed word. And they are going to print millions of anti-slavery tracts. And you see things like in the late 1830s, abolitionist sayings are going to appear everywhere. I mean, posters, emblems, song sheets. You even see them on like things like candy wrappers. Women are also going to be very involved from the beginning of this movement. They'd have their own anti-slavery societies. Their role was initially limited, but they are going to get more and more involved by raising funds, circulating petitions, visiting homes to gain converts to the abolitionist cause. A lot of times they operated out of like local churches And in fact, women really were the grassroots organizers of the massive petition campaign launched in the mid-1830s. The thing is, when we're looking at like the American Anti-Slavery Society and we're looking at William Lloyd Garrison, most of the energy they spend on the abolitionist message is really spent on mass propaganda. It's not necessarily about politics most of the time. Most of the time, it's more about changing public opinion. So it's almost more like social abolitionism.